Hi, and welcome to Metaconscious Leaders. My guest today is a former corporate finance director who is now better known as a cosmologist, planetary healer, futurist, and co founder of the Whole Worldview initiative. She is Dr. Jude Currivan, who has had an extraordinary career bridging the worlds of science, business, and spirit. With a master's degree in physics from Oxford University and a doctorate in archaeology from Reading, she began her professional life as a senior international businesswoman, serving as a group finance director for major companies, including HMV and Scholl, where she led operations across the US, Australia, and Japan. Since then, Jude has become one of the most respected voices exploring how cutting edge science and ancient wisdom converge. Her books, including The Cosmic Hologram and The Story of Gaia, invite us to see the universe not as a machine, but as a living, conscious, and meaningfully informed whole. As a member of the Club of Rome and the Evolutionary Leaders Circle, Jude now works globally with scientists, economists, and systems innovators to catalyze a shift from separation to unity, what she calls a whole worldview. Her work points to a future in which our economies, technologies, and leadership models align with the deeper coherence of life itself. Today, we'll explore what this vision means for leadership, finance, and human well-being in a rapidly transforming world, and understanding the cosmos as a living, intelligent system can reshape how we lead, create, and care for our planet. So welcome, Jude, to Metaconscious Leaders, and thank you for being our guest today.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation, Greg. And I'm delighted that we were introduced by a mutual friend, Sean Mitchell, who I know you've also had on your podcast. So it's
Yes,
lovely to be with you.
and she's been a wonderful guest as well. So, Jude, Metaconscious Leaders is a young and growing community of business leaders with a real appetite for exploring greater meaning and purpose at a moment in time when developments are happening at warp speed. Now, before we get into the topic that we're here to talk about, I think your background in business and your career in finance is a really important backdrop to what you're about to what you now spend your time talking about and researching. So could you give us a sort of a backdrop to that business life of yours before we move into the cosmology and the real nature of reality?
Be delighted to. And I think probably to go back even before I went into business, because my journey of co-weaving, I call it a scenic route because it really has woven so many different threads throughout my life, and starting really when I was very young, when I was having direct experiences that are sometimes called supernormal or noetic or multidimensional, or we can get back into that. But I was having those experiences from a very young age. And of course, they were introducing me, and I was having this wonderful journey and adventure in walking between worlds from that very early age. And it's been a lifetime continuation. So, it was very much different from what I was being taught at school. And as you'll appreciate, it was a very different perspective of a reality from what I was then finding in business. But to just go to your point around business, um, I was having these direct experiences from a very early age. I was also fascinated by science from a very early age, and I was also quite proficient in mathematics from a very early age. And so those were parts of a journey that led me to Oxford University and a master's in physics, where I specialised in quantum physics and cosmology. And then the universe decided that I was not going to become an academic. And at the time, it felt a real setback, but actually it was the best thing that could possibly have happened, because instead I switched tracks, as it were. And because I was good at maths and science and all the rest of it, I went into business, and I started with a company that was then called ICL. That then was taken over by Fujitsu years afterwards. But at ICL, I started to train as an accountant. And because I was interested in the doing of business, even at that point, rather than become a sort of an audit type accountant, I became a cost and management accountant. And
Okay.
I loved it because it really brought the reality of what, I was experiencing in my day-to-day work, and how you could quantify that, but in a way that, for me at any rate, even at that early stage, the quantification was secondary
Yeah.
to the relationships between people
Yeah.
and how people behaved in those, in organizational senses. And ever so early, I began to see organizations as organisms. And I realized that when I did that, and this was again part of my journey on that inner level from a very early age, I really appreciated how every person in an organization, in an organism, were like
Mm.
cells within a body. And if those cells were coherent, if they were able to understand the overall purpose and direction of where the organization was going, and related to each other in healthy ways,
Yeah.
then guess what? The organization itself was healthy. So I was learning some really important life lessons from my
Yeah.
early years training to be an accountant. And those over the next period of time, I moved businesses, and I was promoted and promoted and promoted because I worked really hard and I loved it. It wasn't something that I
Yeah.
felt burdened by. And I never did it because I wanted to be promoted. I just loved doing a good job. I loved just
Yeah.
enjoying what I was doing and doing it well and connecting with people. And I had some extraordinary colleagues, wonderful bosses who, back in the day, this was the 1970s, you know, you heard of the glass ceiling, but for women. But to be honest, had the great fortune not to feel that I was banging against it. I just was
Mm.
enjoying what I was curious. I was wanting to learn more. And over time, I qualified as an accountant. I then became one of the youngest fellows of the Institute of Cost and Management Accountants. Eventually, I became a member of their council, so 40,000 accountants, and head of their technical committee. And at the same time, I was also, as you mentioned earlier, with HMV and Scholl. When I became the finance director of Scholl in the early 1990s, I became at that moment, for a brief shining moment, Greg, the most senior businesswoman in the UK. I was the first woman to be appointed to the board of what was then a top 350 company in the UK.
Yeah.
Um, and that was great. I was loving it. I was traveling the world. I was, with Charlotte, it was 36 countries after HMV and being with them. So I was loving it. And then a time came by the mid 1990s where I just felt that I'd been there, done that, bought the t-shirt, all the rest of it. And I was really sensing from that ongoing journey of inner discovery that I just felt something was coming. I didn't know what it was, but I had a deep sense that being in a corporate position, a corporate environment, was not perhaps the best way I could serve that. And what's really interesting is, having then left business of my own choice in the mid 1990s, um, and doing a lot of other things since, as we can perhaps talk about, I'm now finding that those years have really stood me in good stead, because I'm now
Yeah.
working with some of the leading edge economists, folks who are really wanting to transform the whole financial system and economic system. And when they
Yeah.
find out I'm an accountant, it's like, nerds together. We actually share the same language. So I'm again working with extraordinary people who, through their own
Brilliant.
journeys of this realization that transformation is vital. And they have understanding of how we can do that. And because of my background and my ability to speak that language and understand, the situation, I can be helpful.
Will you say a little bit more about those direct experiences? What exactly do you mean by that?
Well, the first I can recall was about 4 years old when a discarnate light, about the size of a baseball, as it were, sorry, basketball, came into my room. And it was just there. And I heard an inner voice, not through my ears, but I heard an inner voice. And it was such a wonderfully welcoming, kind voice. I didn't know who it was, but at 4 years old, it didn't seem strange. It might seem strange having this conversation with you now, but at 4 years old, to me, it was not strange. And it
Yeah,
really opened the door to a lifetime of exploration where I have been able, as I feel we all are, this is our natural way of being, and working, with many wisdom keepers, discarnate as well as incarnate, and indigenous elders. This is and also knowing the physics of this as a cosmologist, I
yeah.
understand that it is our natural way of being, and yet we've closed our eyes and our ears, inner and outer, to those possibilities in so many ways. So because I didn't do that, because I've never done that, it's been a lifelong journey of telepathic communications, having communications at many different levels with discarnate entities and sentiences, realizing that the nature of reality is far vaster and grander and richer than,
Mhm.
we've been taught, certainly in our Western secular, societies. And
Yeah,
yet indigenous folks, this is a natural way of being. And so it's precognition. I've had out of body experiences. I had many, many, many different, and because they've been direct and because in so many times they've offered me insights that I would not have gained in other ways. They've offered me insights that I've been able to then verify through other means. So it's been
right.
a journey that's not just been a sense of, oh, it's my own imagination. There's been profound ways of which I've learned, I hope I've grown as a person,
Yeah.
and I've gained insights that I would not have gained, I don't think, if I'd have not been willing to continue that journey of exploration on an inner discovery.
I know leaders, significant leaders in industry, who have had such numinous experiences and either don't believe them or won't talk about them because
Yeah.
they're not normal or because it's woo-woo land or because it will show them up in the wrong light. Um, so, so this bringing together of reality in the way that you articulate it is just a wonderful thing, which makes this conversation so valuable, I believe. Um, can we just say one other thing about context? Because context, I
Okay.
think, is really everything in terms of meaning.
Uh-huh.
And just to preface again what we're about to go on to talk about, many, including myself, uh, describe these times in history as a meta crisis or a polycrisis or some such thing. But you, I know, have um, a different and inspirational term for that. Would you say a little bit about how you reframe the meta crisis?
Be happy to. And it's not, by the way, that I'm seeing through fluffy pink lens on all of this. We are in existential times of crisis, and I would suggest, and I know we'll go on to explore that that really is because we've had a worldview of separation, which is now, I would suggest, and we can go into that, being turned on
Yeah.
its head by leading edge science and scientific evidence across many fields of research and many scales of existence. That really is showing us that, separation is an illusion. And yet we have a dis-ease of separation. And that dis-ease of separation in such a worldview, seeing the world through such a lens, I would say we might consider that, exploitation and extraction and injustices and conflicts are all sort of, we might say, I think it's very wrong, but we might say that they're natural. And certainly that's been the way we've behaved, to the point that they are completely unsustainable, and hence our meta crisis. But I'm not blaming or shaming the journey we've been on till now, because what I also feel is that instead of framing that as a meta crisis, we could perhaps open up to a reframing of it as a metamorphosis. And as an evolutionary biologist, along with many other hats and a cosmologist, metamorphosis is the most extraordinary process where, as we know, from a caterpillar to a butterfly, that process, that life process, turns everything on its head.
Mm.
When a caterpillar goes into a cocoon after eating as much as it possibly can, which is pretty much how we've been behaving, I don't, as far as anything we know at the moment, it doesn't know that it's going to come out the other end as a butterfly. But it goes into that cocoon almost because it has no choice but to go into that cocoon. It's an urge agency rather than an urgency, an urge agency to go into that cocoon. In that cocoon, the caterpillar's body pretty much dissolves into a nutrient soup. And what happens is the DNA that has sort of set the template for the caterpillar phase of the whole life story it breaks down. The immune system breaks down, the DNA does so. And then what is happening is the DNA of the butterfly, which has been there from the beginning, but has been inactive, becomes activated. And the imaginal cells are activated from that DNA template of the emergent butterfly. And then during that process, the new body of the butterfly, legs, wings, vitally new eyes begin to form. Because when that butterfly completes into its ability to be free of the cocoon, it literally sees the world through new eyes. And then it goes into the
Mm.
world with a completely different way of living its life. It's a pollinator rather than an extractor. And so I feel that at the moment, we are now waking up the DNA that's been there from the beginning, but now is being activated within us to become imaginal cells of this potential and emergent evolutionary possibility of becoming. I'm always going to say human butterflies, but I hope you know what I mean. We literally can then see the world with new eyes. We can live in new ways, and new ways that are part of a universe that, as you mentioned earlier, and I'd love us to explore this further, I would say meaningfully exist to purposefully evolve. And we are
Yeah.
part of its emergent potential and evolutionary purpose.
Yeah. Beautifully articulated. Thank you so much for that. I'd heard a little bit of that before, Jude, but the way you fleshed it out and a bit about the DNA and that soup bit as well. Oh, lovely, fantastic. Thank you so much. So, right, let's get into it. Every civilization bases its meaning and purpose on its philosophy. And then in accordance with that, it developed laws and institutions and culture and everything else which fulfill the meaning it's kind of derived from. How do you characterize our current worldview, and how have we come to be where we are today? And kind of what have been the consequences of that? Take us through that little phase before we get to what really is the reality.
Be delighted to. And of course, this is from my own perspective. So I always please, I am a student of history as well, or her story. So much of her story has not come into the awareness yet, but I think it will do. But yeah, I mean, my PhD actually in archaeology was the transition, one might say transformation, from the Middle Stone Age, the Mesolithic, to the Neolithic or the New Stone Age. And that was characterized by people, again, living very different lives. In the Mesolithic, people were primarily hunter-gatherers. Um, as that transformation to the Neolithic happened, they became pastoralists and farmers. And crucially, their sense of themselves and their relationship to the wider world also was transformed through that process, which was perhaps some of the earliest sort of examples of ongoing change in our human story. And I was really curious because before that transition, people revered, as far as we can have any sense of, like indigenous communities today, revered the natural world. They
Yeah.
saw themselves as part of a web of life, and that web of life was far more than biological relatives. It was all our relations.
Yeah.
And they didn't alter the altar, the sacred altar. They didn't alter the sacred altar. And yet when that transformation into the Neolithic happened, they started to alter the altar by building monuments. And I live in a wonderful part of Britain, near Stonehenge and Avebury, where we have huge monuments dating from that period. But we also know that they didn't arrive just out of nowhere. There was a whole timeline of moving towards larger and larger monuments.
Right.
And they reflected heaven and earth. They brought us, people into the center of that. But the point I'm making is that part of that PhD for me was looking at how those transformations happen in different places, in different ways around the world, not just in that time, which was sort of, 6,000 years ago to about 3,000 years ago. But later, and as you say, people have their own views about who they are, how they relate with each other, how they relate to the wider world, and therefore the structures and all of the societal and economic structures they
Mm.
put around that. So I'm going to jump fast forward from that Neolithic transformation through others into a period around the 1600s, because by the 1600s in Western Europe, the church was the power base, and any curiosity about the nature of who we are and how we are was through the lens of the church. And yet people were starting to becoming more curious about wanting to investigate the world. And so you had people like Copernicus and Kepler and Galileo,
Yeah.
who were starting to observe the natural world and seeing things that weren't in the remit, weren't in the framing of the church, to the
Yeah.
extent that Galileo was under house arrest for most of his life. And when there's a story of him discovering the moons of Jupiter through a telescope, newly invented telescope, and the priests would refuse to look up the telescope. They'd refuse to look up the telescope. So as that time moved on, what you did get is this separation, this schism, because clearly what this was beginning to open up was unstoppable in terms of curiosity and so-called natural philosophers wanting to explore the world. And there was a view was, okay, you can go and do that because actually it's probably unstoppable. And you cannot study anything that is not physical. In other
Yeah.
words, anything that is spiritual, anything that is in the remit of religion is out of bounds. And, people were killed when they crossed that red threshold. So we had a situation from the sort of 1600s onwards where progressively the remit of natural philosophers that then became known as scientists were looking more and more into the natural world, and the remit of religions and religious authority continued to hold sway in those areas. By the 19th century, it seems to me that that separation, as it were, had become, at its fullness. And what was amazing, of course, was that science was able to make discoveries and therefore drive inventions that by the middle of the 19th century were driving the Industrial Revolution.
Yep.
And it was a secular science. It was a science that had nothing to do with spirituality or realms beyond the physical. It was a secular science that was effectively mechanistic. It had a very, by then, mechanistic view of the world. And so the discoveries and the inventions were very mechanistic and they were powerful. They were driving the Industrial Revolution. And that
Yep.
in itself was so powerful that its structures were based on the same science as its discoveries and its inventions. So the education was founded on educating people to become cogs in the machines of the Industrial Revolution. The economics was about how do you extract and exploit to drive the Industrial Revolution and economies and trade and all
Mm.
the rest of it. Healthcare was not about the whole person. It had nothing to do with emotions or mental health. let alone spiritual health. It was, how do you get physical bodies able to turn up in factories and work 10-hour shifts for 6 days a week? So the whole of the 19th century was grounded, and the late 19th century was grounded in this mechanistic science. And that is the worldview that's pertained ever since, because it was so powerful. And the Industrial Revolution and its technological, generations that followed have been so powerful in so many ways that that mechanistic science has been the framing and the underpinning that's pertained to today, even though the scientific discoveries of quantum physics and relativity theory in the 20th century were giving us major clues that that mechanistic science was by no means the whole story, and actually, in many ways, profoundly mistaken. But its power drove the economics we have, the financial system we have, the organizational structures we have, their hierarchies. It's driven our allopathic healthcare. It's driven the education of our children. So it's not education. It's the opposite. It's pushing in stuff that enables those young people, when they leave school, to be ready to go into the industrial complex that's still the mainstream way of being, and it's breaking down. And it's breaking down.
And it has an inertia, doesn't it?
Like most things, it has an inertia, but also, if we look at the story of our universe and we look at the story of our planetary home that I refer to as Gaia, as a sentient being, we also see that evolution trumps, and I mean that, and I'm using that word, trumps inertia.
Yeah. Yeah.
Evolution trumps inertia.
Yeah. And whilst evolution of systems and culture is sometimes glacial, the change comes from individuals and the shift in consciousness of the individuals, because they're what essentially make up the whole.
Indeed, indeed. And what I would say is, you say it's glacial, but that really isn't the case. Evolution, I mean, both at a universal level and at a planetary level, has different, it's almost like, it's a major highway with different speeds on it. Certainly, if we look at the last 4 billion years or so from our beginning of our planetary home and our solar family, it's tended to move forward from simplicity to complexity, in 3 sort of speeds: very slow speed, middle range speed, and incredibly fast speed. When environments are fairly stable, then indeed it's slow. And I would say that that's been the case with us since the last ice age. So what's called the Holocene, about the last 12,000 years or so, really, I mean, in evolutionary terms, has been quite slow. Very few new species. There's been adaptations, of course. And this is what Darwin was looking at. He was looking at adaptations. He talked about in his book on the origin of species, but he didn't really find out much about the origin of species. He found how natural selection can drive and natural selection can drive adaptation, but that's slow speed. We know from the way Gaia's orbit is around our sun that there are longer cycles. We have a wobble on our axis. We have a sort of tilt on our axis. Our orbit is elliptical, and that varies itself. There are a whole series of interconnected cycles called Milankovitch cycles that operate from a few thousand years to a couple of 100,000 years. What they do is that they move the various environments around our planetary home. So they give environmental niches that are open to more evolution of different species. Yeah. So that's a mid-range. And then we get potential for catastrophic breakdowns. And what they have done in the past is engender dramatic, radical breakthroughs in terms of evolutionary emergence. And each time there's been a whole step function in terms of the level of complexity as the whole of Gaia's biosphere, but not just her biosphere, the entirety of our planet's interrelational, interdependent evolution has moved forward. And that
An
has often
example of that?
involved,
An
yeah, I
example of
mean,
that,
that
Jude?
two examples of that. First of all, what's called the Cambrian explosion. That happened after a fairly stable period called the Ediacaran Age. And the Cambrian explosion happened about 500 million years ago. And the Ediacaran Age was it's often called the garden of the Ediacaran garden, like the Garden of Eden, because everybody was really friendly with everybody else. And you had the beginnings of animals, you had plants and animals, but there was very little predator-prey relationships. And so very little evolution for quite some time. And then there was a massive change in the environment. And out of that, and leading up to that, but it then took a huge step forward, was the beginning of what's called the biomineralization toolkit. In other words, biological evolution was starting to form the possibilities of skeletons and teeth and claws. Yeah? And
Yeah,
what you had with the Cambrian explosion is that then became a whole sort of literal arms race between predators and prey. But what that did is it drove complexity, because to avoid
correct.
being eaten, the prey had to get more complex. And to make sure that they were able to eat, the predators had to get more complex. So
Yeah,
you had this movement forward. But even then, oddly enough, it was more cooperative. It was almost like the entire biosphere, Gaia had decided that she was going to evolve this whole series of relationships, which also enabled the culling of the weak, which strengthened then
yeah,
species. Yeah, because the predators were preying on the weak. And so that strengthened the prey.
yeah,
And there was this whole interrelationship. And through the whole process, from then onwards, we find that every time when there's a major move forward, it drives through cooperation
right.
rather than through competition. Complexity is driven through cooperation. So we had that then, we've had that in a number of cases since, and we had it 66 million years ago when the asteroid that really drove the demise of the dinosaurs, our ancestors, our mammalian ancestors, tiny little shrew-like creatures, scurrying around in the undergrowth, probably at night, in a very, very short time, became the dominant and most complex biological organisms
Yeah,
on our planet. And
yeah,
this comes through something called reticulate assembly often. And reticulate assembly, therefore, it's not this sort of slow DNA lineage of itself. It's this incredible, and this happens in business too. And I'd love us to share how this happens in organizations. It's when a lot of factors come together. And that includes something called horizontal gene transfer. So instead of the lineage of DNA, horizontal gene transfer that's often driven by viruses, bacteria. And it's there because the whole of our planet, our planetary home, is essentially sentient. This comes because we have to look deeper than the appearance of the physical world to realize that underpinning that is this universal intelligence.
What was the term that you gave to that, Jude?
There's reticulate assembly, which is
Okay.
all about how many different factors come together in these times of breakdown and breakthrough. And also part of that is ways by which the things called horizontal gene transfers, or HGTs, and that is driven by viruses that are evolutionary agents, bacteria, fungi, all, everybody comes into play, as it were, to
Yeah,
take the next level of complexity forward. And I would talk about now our conversation today, you and I, is part of what I call horizontal meme transfers, because we're sharing ideas that are part
yeah,
of this metamorphosis, it
yeah,
seems to me.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. So reticulous assembly. We'll come back to that because I really want to link this back into business because that's such an important
Absolutely.
aspect to this. It's not just about some intellectual exploration of what's the nature of reality. It's like, what does it mean to us
Absolutely.
in our everyday lives? That is what is so important. It's that application which we want to
Absolutely.
get to. So can you now address what is the nature of the universe? Who are we? Why are we sitting on this rock flying through space? Tell us about this in formation, a bit more about that and more.
Be happy to in 3 minutes or less. Be delighted to. Well, just going back to what we were saying, our current worldview, our prevailing worldview, has been one of a mechanistic universe, which is essentially without meaning or purpose. It's told a story, it's told our story as somehow arising out of random, almost accidental processes of biology that although, as Darwin said, it's about natural selection, there's very little that in depth of that takes us to a deeper
Yeah,
understanding. And also the natural selection that would have driven our universe from 14 billion years ago when our best understanding is when our universe began to now, if they were through random accidental processes of natural selection, has been analyzed. There's no way we would be here. It would have taken trillions on trillions on trillions of years for those processes to finally find a way of getting to us. And also the other perspective of this is that somehow consciousness arises from immaterial consciousness arises from a material brain. So that's been the worldview that we've been educated about. It's the worldview that pretty much prevails our economic, financial, corporate system and our social systems. And fundamentally, it's wrong. And one of the really important points is just that we're at this point of metacrisis with the potential to be a metamorphosis.
okay.
We're also discovering the evidence that I briefly mentioned, and it's at all scales of all scales of existence and across numerous fields of research, are turning that view on its head. And instead, what we're discovering is that yes, our universe began, to the best understanding and evidence we have, about 13.8 billion years ago. We were taught, I'm sure you were taught, I was certainly taught that it began as a big bang. Actually, I wasn't taught that at school because I'm too old to have been taught that at school. That was what was coming into focus when I was just about to go to university.
Mm,
This idea of the Big Bang, and the point is, of course, it's not big; it's tiny. And
mm,
the name was given by Fred Hoyle, who didn't agree with it at all. But the word bang implies chaos. It already sets that sense of randomness and chaos and accident from the very beginning of our universe. So first of all, we know that our universe did not begin in a big bang. Yes, it did in the sense that it was minute, but to call it a bang is a misnomer. It began in the most exquisitely fine-tuned, incredibly ordered state, and in such a way that it's enabled the laws of physics and the relationships to the laws of physics have enabled the profound interdependence to continue forward. So space has expanded ever since that first moment, and time's flowed forward ever since that first moment. The universe has been able to undertake a journey from simplicity to ever greater levels of complexity. And we need
yeah,
to go deeper than that. Because if we talk about energy, matter, and space time, which we do,
yeah,
and so much has been discovered in the 20th century about quantized energy matter and the relativity of space and time, which we therefore have to put together to be invariant space time, all that is great.
yeah,
But when those discoveries were happening and people like Einstein were also realizing that that wasn't the whole story, that
mm,
we had to look deeper, those deeper questions were put to the side. And now they're coming back again because the evidence is now overwhelming that we can't just talk about the energy, matter, and space time of our universe. That is, yes, its appearance. that is its reality as manifested. But that reality, that appearance emerges from deeper, non-physical realms of meaning and causation. And what it's showing us is that deeper universal consciousness and causation is effectively creating a universe that is essentially meaningful, existentially meaningful, and purposeful in its evolutionary journey. And so the fundamental stuff of the universe, we're realizing, is not energy and matter and space-time. That's its appearance. The fundamental stuff of our universe is meaningful information that arises from these deeper realms of intelligence and causation. And therefore, that mind and consciousness aren't something we have. They're not something that's found a way of coming into reality after billions of years. They're what we and the whole world
Yeah.
fundamentally are. They are our existential reality.
Yeah. The big breath.
The big breath.
We could, Jude, talk on this topic and go into it in more depth. I'm going to put in the links to the show notes to a couple of your videos where you talk in greater detail about what you've just been speaking of, so that listeners can go there and hear in much more depth your kind of expansion of that topic. But can we leave it just there for the moment and bring that back into business and talk about what are the ramifications of this alternative, not this alternative, this it's almost a re-envisioned or a rediscovered or remembered um, uh, understanding of who we are and what is the nature of reality. What does that mean to us in business? I've always found in my work that business people, just below the surface, that they are thirsting for greater meaning and purpose. We put most of our effort and energies into our business, and quite frankly, just about everything on the planet now is either business or has a business commercial aspect to it. So even education, healthcare, you name it. And I mean, business for me is not a thing. It's a doing. Yeah, it's simply the balancing of inputs and outputs to ensure that there's a kind of equilibrium that we reach, whereby this thing can continue. But businesses seems to have become rather um, uh, framed as something that makes a profit. And that's the purpose of it. But in fact, it really isn't. It's not the purpose of it. Actually, the profit is necessary in order to sustain the purpose. So then it brings you back to what's the purpose. So from your notable career in business, what did you learn of greatest value, and how does that sort of feed now into how you view business and how it can evolve to be part of the solution, if you like, as opposed to part of the problem?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I go back to what I was saying a bit earlier, Greg, that I saw businesses as organisms quite early on. And I've always been interested as a cosmologist and also as an evolutionary biologist, but also evolution in going beyond biology, evolution as a universal impulse, as a universal flow from simplicity to complexity. So I saw sort of businesses as organisms potentially in a living planetary system. And so what are the principles of healthy living systems? And for me, a living system goes beyond biology. My perspective is that our entire universe is essentially living. So if we look at it on that level, our entire planetary home is a sentient being within a living universe. And therefore, when we look at the health of our planetary home, we're looking not just at the biosphere. I see our entire planet as what I call a Gaiosphere rather than just a biosphere. So I see Gaia's rocks and minerals, her geosphere. I see her waters, her hydrosphere. I see her air, her atmosphere, as well as her biological organisms, her biosphere. And over 4 billion years, what I tracked in The Story of Gaia, the book you mentioned earlier, is that story of an meaningfully existing and purposely evolving planetary home within a living universe. And so I see organizations, I see businesses as part of that when they are healthy, that when they're not there just for profit, because the Gaia sphere is not there for profit. Healthy living systems are about interdependent relationships, right relationships, reciprocity, circulation. Yeah. Not wasting. And yet also not just being circular in not wasting and living within planetary boundaries, but also, and this is really key to work that I'm currently doing with some leading economists, including John Fullerton, who's just bringing a book out called Regenerative Economics. And John and I have been talking about entropy. Entropy as the informational content, the meaningful informational content of a system which grows through time, which evolves through time. So in that regard, we're talking about organizations and businesses that align with healthy planetary living systems, both in terms of their existential meaning and evolutionary potential.
There's a lot that's spoken about sustainability, um, but there appears to me to be some fundamental, almost structural issues that militate against sustainability. So, for instance, our obsession with competition,
Yeah.
competitive advantage, dominance, all these sort of
Yeah.
things. And how can we still be holding on to these at the same time as talking about sustainability? What would you identify as the fundamental changes that need to happen in businesses in order for us to move towards what is genuinely sustainable
Mhm.
activities?
I think we need to really see this as the whole ecosystem. Yeah. Because if we just say, what can businesses do? I mean, I was a finance director of a public limited company in Shoal, and I knew therefore, what the investors were looking for and, a rate of return and how that might work through. And that really drives a lot of competition, but it drives it in different levels. I mean, working in the States, working in the US, I would say is extreme form of capitalism. The UK are lesser, but still, focused very much on profit. But in other parts of the world, there is less focus on profit and more of a partnership approach and a community approach to what businesses can do. And my sense is it really requires everybody from investors, people like insurance companies, pension companies, people who are measuring metrics of what is valuable and what isn't. I mean, part of the problem we have is we're not accounting for reality. A friend of mine, Andrew Watson, is doing remarkable work in terms of looking at how we actually account for what we do, and what we count counts. Yeah. So if we're counting the wrong thing, then guess what? We do the wrong thing. So that's part of it in the sense of if we account for reality, we include what we've excluded. We call them externalities, but in an interdependent planet, there are no externalities. Everything is interdependent with everything else. We basically incentivize doing harm rather than doing good. We don't take the intangibles and show that the opportunity cost of doing the wrong thing is actually growing exponentially. Putting off doing the right thing, doing the wrong thing is costing us as an opportunity cost more and more and more, and yet we're not accounting for it. So I think one aspect is actually moving our accounting so that it reflects reality and so that we can incentivize doing good rather than doing harm. That's one thing. Secondly, those people who are responsible for investing, whether it be insurers, whether it be pension funds or investors across every ilk, if they know what they're investing in is actually reflecting accurately the reality of what those businesses are doing, I would hope that would open up to more responsible investment. There are already folks who really want to take responsible investment forward, just like the Norwegian sovereign fund do and many others. Insurance people, the whole insurance ecosystem has a part to play in what's insured and what isn't. And then I think people within businesses, within organizations themselves, really, really coming to their own levels of integrity and not just seeing that it is all about profit, because we know when we do the right thing, businesses are more profitable. And we've got the studies for that, we've got the show for that. So I would just invite and more people, I think, come into partnership. Let's, instead of a domination culture, partnership cultures are inevitably more sustainable, regenerative, healthy, and that's how we can actually align with healthy living systems, planetary systems.
Yeah. It occurs to me as I'm asking the question, what do you think business should be doing? At the same time, I've got, it's not about doing, it's about being.
It's
And when
both.
Einstein said that we can't solve a problem at the level of thinking that we created it, we need to go
Absolutely.
to another level. So we need to go to a meta level in order to and raise our awareness and our understanding
Yeah.
of life, nature of reality, and so forth, before coming back down and then doing the doing, if you like, with more wisdom.
I think it's both and it's a dance. I'm in lots of conversations at the moment that are coming, that were a year ago even coming from the either or. We need to change our awareness to change our behaviors. And other folks say, no, 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 we have to change our behaviors to change our awareness. And more now, there is the both and, the being and the doing, the inner and the outer as an ongoing, just as we breathe in and out, we wouldn't sort of stop breathing out before we could breathe in or vice versa. We do it naturally because that's the wholeness of how we live. So again, I think it's the being and the doing of it. It's the how
Yeah,
can we change behaviors that then helps people to see things in a different way, and how we can go on that inner journey that naturally from the inside out means that we look at the world in a different way and we make different choices about the world because of that.
right. What are the changes or features of what's happening now in business, or in the business world, that most excite you, that most fill you with optimism, if you like, as to insofar as that they are signs of an emergent new paradigm?
I think what's really exciting for me is the evidence that I mentioned, and you'll put the links I know into the show notes, but the evidence that separation is an illusion is now so powerful. And because it is at all scales, it's not just at the very large or the very small, it's at all scales of existence, and not just in terms of physics and cosmology, but in human systems, in our collective behaviors, in evolution, all of it. The evidence is so powerful. And, in 2022, the Nobel Prize for Physics was given for the what we call settled science, that our universe meaningfully exists and purposely evolves as a unitive entity. The Nobel Prize was given for an understanding that there is no separation. There is
Right,
diversification, there's differentiation, but our universe meaningfully exists and evolves as a unitive entity. That's settled science. So for business people who want evidence, who want measurements and quantification, and who may be having their own inner experiences but still consider it, as you said earlier, woo woo, or they're concerned about sharing it, I would say be bold, come out, share it, because we've got the evidence that supports that. Intuition is our superpower,
yeah,
supports that love is far more than a sentiment. Love is a universal evolutionary force.
Yeah.
We've got the evidence that you can stand on that ground. You can feel strong on that ground. You can feel framed and underpinned and empowered and inspired by this. And the point is that this is, if you really want to look at the business opportunity, the business opportunities from a worldview of wholeness and its unity and diversity, I would say, are far greater than the business opportunities that come from a worldview of separation and mechanism.
Yeah.
There's some extraordinary, because they're evolutionary. This is what, it seems to me the universe is inviting us into this adventure. And
Yeah.
the business people who are saying yes to it, who from their own inner journey of discovery are bringing that into their outer doingness to serve this emergence, this adventure, this wonderful potential that we have. And doing so not from a domination culture, but from a partnership perspective, and a partnership with others, other people, and our whole world. They are the ones that will lead the way, it seems to me.
Beautifully put. And I concur completely with you, Jude, on that one. I'm very aware of time. I certainly would love this to have been more of an introductory conversation with you, because there are so many different rabbit holes that we could disappear down that we've really touched upon. Artificial intelligence is one that I wanted to cover. Um, but we haven't got time to go into that at the moment. I don't know if you already said more than a couple of words about it. The one thing that comes to my mind is Gandhi said there's more to life than making it happen faster, and my thoughts are that some use of AI is simply seen in that context. But you have a different view. If you can very quickly encapsulate, I've heard you talk about conscious AI as being in some way involved with or part of this evolution of consciousness.
Yeah, as you say, it's a very big topic, and I'm working with some amazing people, including a wonderful philosopher builder, as he describes himself, Grant Story, who co-founded something called Kieran AI. And
Yeah,
Grant's approach is one that I wholeheartedly appreciate, because it's about AI as augmented rather than artificial, but it's augmented to support a human-led, heart-centered way forward. And when we look at the unitive science that I write about and share, the unitive evidence-based science, then having that way of looking at AI, and I'm working with others in this regard, how unitive science can support and empower transformational change in the world, whether it's economics and finance through businesses, whether it is AI, whether it's education, whether it's healthcare, because
yeah,
that unity and diversity, and a world of meaning and evolutionary purpose, a world of love, a living world, a loving world, then, what we bring to AI, there was this whole thing about garbage in, garbage out at the beginning of the computer age. But now we've had so much of AI development is in the industrial military worlds, and coming from people with a very mechanistic perspective. So guess what? We've actually got circumstances now of ChatGPT inviting people to kill themselves and lying and in denial, because what we're bringing to it is that level of awareness. If we can bring this unitive perspective of
yeah,
awareness into AI, what an amazing companion it can be
yeah.
as we go forward.
Yeah. A topic to revisit, hopefully, at another occasion. I wish we could, but time is our master on this particular stage, and we need to look at wrapping up. But before we close, I've heard you say that now is our moment of choice. What would you say to the many people who are finding the challenges that are being faced as being quite extraordinarily difficult? Um, how can they hold their center in the midst of what appears like a raging storm of change?
Again, I think there are two things. One is with all of that turbulence, and again, looking at the story of our journey so far, there have been times of great turbulence in our world. I would say choose love. Choose love of family and friends and fellow travelers. Choose love, within your organization. Choose care and kindness and compassion, because that is our center. That is our profound center. And we look outside and we see all the turbulence, but choosing cruelty, choosing fear does not serve us. Doesn't
Yeah.
serve us personally, it doesn't serve us collectively. So that's the first and perhaps most important thing. I would say choose love always. And then the second thing is link up and lift up together. Find coalitions of the willing and come together. And because when we do that, when we come together in those ways, we amplify our presence, we amplify what we can bring into the world. We can bring what is ours to do, but we can do it in a way that is far more coherent and is greater than some of the parts. That's the joy of when we bring love and life and what is ours to do into a circle of compassion, into a circle of potential, and then link up and lift up together, miracles happen.
Yeah. Jude, you are a bright beacon of light, and your insights are inspirational. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you for being a phenomenal guest today. And please do come back and talk to us again in the future. Until then, thank you and be well.
Thank you, Greg. I'll be delighted to come back.
I hope you enjoyed today's conversation with Jude as much as I did. And if you want further information about her and her work, you'll find the links in the show notes below. Please subscribe, follow, like us if you haven't already done so. This is a very helpful way of enabling us to reach a wider audience. Also, you can share this link with others and leave a comment. It's really useful for us to know what you're thinking as well. Until next week, thank you for listening and watching. Be well.